Hello, Jim, Garrett. Nice to meet you both.
Hey,
Nice to meet you. I'm Jim.
and
Hi,
I'm Garrett.
hi, Garrett. Hi, Jim.
Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, well, thank you for obviously reading the piece in the Times and for reaching out.
Yeah, it's so exciting to have you here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We should just dive right in. I usually do a spiel, but everybody knows what a podcast is now.
Well, and Jim, you have to run at 5. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm actually my Shakespeare class is performing, so I have to go.
All right, great. Well, I've been poking around on your website and listening to some episodes, so I think I have a
Oh,
pretty good sense of how wide the range of topics is that you cover.
Yeah.
And it's not
Good
just
news.
to
We just
not just acting, but it's also, the state of the union of Shakespeare.
so
yeah.
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 Well, we'll dive right in. Hello and welcome to the State of Shakespeare. I'm Garrett Vandermeer,
And I'm Jim Elliott.
and today on the program we're joined by Drew Lichtenberg. Hello, Drew.
Hi, how you doing, Garrett and Jim? Nice to be here.
So glad to have you.
Welcome.
You are artistic producer. Is there a definite article there?
Technically, I am the artistic producer at Shakespeare Theatre Company in Washington, D.C., but I've also been the dramaturg in residence there for 14 or 15 years now. So many titles.
We'll circle back to that in a moment. But you have been associated with the Shakespeare Theatre Company in DC since 2011. You've worked on over 55 productions there, and you've worked at the Royal Theatre in London, on and off Broadway, and at regional theaters all over the country. You currently teach at Catholic University and the Shakespeare Theatre Company Academy at George Washington University, and you have taught at Yale and the New School.
That's right.
And you are the author of 2 books, including Shakespeare in the Theatre, Shakespeare Theatre Company. And we should mention that you are the co-host of Shakespeare Hour Live, which, why don't you tell us what Shakespeare Hour Live is?
Yeah, the Shakespeare Hour Live was a series that my colleague, Simon Godwin, STC's artistic director, and I co-hosted during the pandemic. It was a time of existential fear for many, many theaters, including STC. We did not know how we were going to keep the doors open. And we also didn't know what the future was for the art form. So one of the things that we did was we decided, let's just pick a night every week and meet and talk. And we put out feelers. We asked, we inquired. So everybody was stuck in their homes. We talked to Dame Helen Mirren, which was a very memorable episode. We talked to Gregory Duran of the Royal Shakespeare Company. It was a kind of moment where there was an international community of Shakespeare lovers that we were able to be part of. And, I still hear from people who come up to me at the theater and say, that's what kept me going, was hearing Shakespeare's words and talking about Shakespeare, being in conversation with Shakespeare. It's funny how during the Blitz in World War II, people were able to go to the theaters, but during the pandemic, during lockdown, we were not able to do the same thing. So we were sort of performing a civic service as well as, trying to keep the lights on at the theater. So it was a really special moment in time.
Yeah, a wonderful way to build community when it was really, really desperately needed.
I have to say, Shakespeare in DC is booming.
Yeah, well, that was the thesis of this book that I just wrote for the Arden series on Shakespeare Theatre, is that not only is Shakespeare Theatre internationally significant company, and I'm biased because I've worked there for over a decade, but Washington, D.C. is one of the world capitals of Shakespeare. It's the Stratford on the Potomac. We probably have per capita more Shakespeare in D.C. than any city in probably America, if not the world. We're right up there with Stratford-on-Avon, the Stratford Festival in Canada, Ashland. We're very much in conversation with all of those other centers of Shakespeare.
What do you attribute that to?
It's something that I thought about a lot with my co-author, Deborah Payne, who's a professor at American University. And one of the things that we realized is that living in Washington, there's a kind of Shakespearean theater that's happening all the time off stage. And Washington, D.C. itself is an extremely theatrical landscape. It was planned by Pierre L'Enfant, a French architect who was an engineer who served in the George Washington's troops. And he laid out the entire city kind of like a neoclassical theater with all these diagonal avenues that are kind of like the vomitorium and the the grid, which is kind of like the seats. So,
Mm.
you have the Capitol sitting on top of the hill, like it's the center stage of the entire city. And you have the National Mall, which is an extremely theatrical landscape with all of these monuments. And then you have these very Shakespearean real life figures. Trump being, not the only one, right? Richard Nixon in the 1970s during Watergate was constantly being compared to Shakespearean characters. LBJ was constantly evoking Shakespearean comparisons. So it's a city where the mere act of staging a Shakespeare play is not apolitical. It is constantly in conversation with whatever is happening in Washington, and because we're in Washington, it's in conversation with the whole world. When we did King Lear in 2022, that was at the height of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and so it became a play about a mad king presiding over a country that is in the midst of a turbulent civil war. It became a kind of commentary on what was happening in Eastern Europe, which we could not have predicted or planned. When we chose King Lear for our season. It sort of is interesting how a lot of times fiction or theater ends up reflecting reality and vice versa in the work that we do. And we had Cordelia wearing Zelensky style fatigues at the end of the show. It was a lot of fun, but it was also something that our audiences really took seriously. They're really interested in these kind of stories of power and stories of order run amok, stories of disorder that's happening on a national political scale, because that's the conversation. That's the water cooler conversation in Washington. So it has a different kind of resonance here. And I think that, the other thing that's really weird is that we don't have our own national playwright. We kind of have adopted England's national playwright, even though we fought a revolutionary war to liberate ourselves from the English. There's a complicated and interesting relationship with Anglophilia in Washington, D.C. that goes back a very long way. And I think, you can see the colonial inheritance is still very vivid everywhere you walk around in Washington.
And certainly, I mean, Shakespeare, a lot of people talk about Shakespeare as this, like, the mirror up to human nature and that kind of stuff. But he is extraordinarily political, and his plays are flexible enough so that if you wanted to give them a political slant, you could very simply.
Yeah, the politics of Shakespeare's plays, Hamlet is not just a moody teenager or a moody guy in his late 20s. He's also the prince of a police state, and he is under constant surveillance by Polonius, who's sort of the master of spies, as well as a possible father-in-law. So just like in the Greek plays, these are plays about character and plays about humanity, but there is a socio-political filter that Shakespeare is thinking of at all times, when he's writing the plays. In Washington, in America, we really did emerge as the big world power in the early 20th century. And what's so fascinating is that if you think of Washingtonian bardolatry, the establishment of the Folger Library happened post World War I, with the rise of this class of American oligarchs and robber barons who were traveling the world. And one of the things they were doing was collecting Shakespeare folios, or at least Henry Folger was. So there's this very kind of conscious dialogue in Washington and in America with British Empire, because we become the new empire. And you walk around Washington and signs of empire are everywhere. And that's something that Shakespeare was also obsessed with. Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra, Coriolanus, these are plays about the Roman Republic turning into the Roman Empire. And he's very much thinking about his London, I think the way a lot of citizens of Washington think about the district and think about America today. So it's just an inescapable reality of when you live here as a Washingtonian.
Would this be on the wane at the moment?
Right.
Your most recent article, your opinion piece in the New York Times, which was "Who's Afraid of William Shakespeare?"
Right. Apologies to Edward Albee for the title of that headline. Yeah, I mean, when that's another thing about working in the Shakespeare industry in America, is that you're very sensitive to national and national trends, especially. in England, you have the Royal Shakespeare Company and you have the National Theatre, both of whom are devoted to producing Shakespeare. And you have regional theaters in England. But what's remarkable about America is that you have, I think, in 46 of the 50 US states, more than 100 members of the Shakespeare Theatre Association. So America has way more Shakespeare festivals and Shakespeare theaters, ironically, than England does. And what that allows you to do is look at all the data and observe the waxing and waning popularity of Shakespeare's plays in production on stage. We know that they're required for the college essay and they're taught in high schools and colleges, but how actually popular are Shakespeare's plays? Well, in America, it's very easy to make those statistical inferences. So a friend of mine who's a literary editor who I'm working on my next book with, and that book is about Shakespeare and censorship, asked me to write this piece because, she had noticed that the Hudson Valley Shakespeare Festival, not to name names, I'm trying not to single out any specific Shakespeare theater, but they had no Shakespearean play in their season. And we had only one Shakespearean play in our season this season. And we are not anomalous. If you look at around the country, a lot of Shakespeare theaters are producing observably less Shakespeare. So I was trying to, puzzle out the reasons why that could be.
Before we just to circle back on this statistic that you mentioned, I want to underscore this because it's really remarkable, and you can tell me if I'm reading this correctly. But you mentioned that the Shakespeare Theatre Association in America has over 100 members.
Yes, an American Theater Magazine polls all 558 members of TCG, which is the Theater Communications Group.
Member theaters, of which presumably there are most of the theater companies that are members of the Shakespeare Theatre Association are represented.
Also. Right. So 1/5 of those companies are Shakespeare specific, or theaters that were founded with a Shakespearean mission.
And out of all of these companies, how many total productions of Shakespeare were staged in 2023 and 24?
So in 2023-24, which was last season, there were 40 productions of Shakespeare's plays, according to American Theater Magazine. And that is down from 52 from the season before, which is almost a 25% decline. But the other thing is that in 2018-2019, there were 96 productions of Shakespearean plays. So that means that and 2018-2019 was the last season before the pandemic forced lockdowns and closures of theaters. So that means that theater as a whole has probably declined, but specifically Shakespeare has declined by more than 50% in the last 5 years on American stages, which is an eye-opening statistic, no matter how you slice it.
Yeah, we became aware of it because every so often Garrett and I go fishing for guests, which means we go to the various theater companies and say, what are they doing? And let's see who we know. And we noticed, I think the first one we noticed was Alabama Shakes did not have a Shakespeare offering for their season. And it shocked me, actually. It was quite shocking.
Now, that's not true of this upcoming season, but this is recently.
I think that's the question. Is this a momentary blip, right? Is this just a statistical anomaly? Or is it a larger trend that's going to continue? And you could argue it both ways. We don't know, obviously, right? But there has been, for whatever reason, a noticeable decline. And there's probably a series of factors, of which I suggest a few in the Times piece that I wrote.
And what are these factors?
Well, actually, one of the controversial ones is, I think, pretty obvious, which is that Shakespeare plays are big and expensive. And people in the comments were saying, Shakespeare, you can do it on an empty stage and you can do it with a poor theater aesthetic and it doesn't need to be extravagant. But I think that's missing a larger point, which is that they have large cast sizes, and also they have traditionally been excuses for especially Shakespeare Theatre companies to kind of show off what they can do that other companies can't do, which is afford lavish costumes, right? Have a costume shop that's producing tons of these beautiful period costumes, whatever period the director has set it in, and these kind of like very, very nifty sets. I think Shakespeare is associated in the American theater audience's mind with spectacle and with lavish production budgets, even though we know that 400 years ago, Shakespeare's company themselves performed on an empty stage. Costume shops have gotten smaller, production departments have gotten smaller. A lot of those departments have unionized in the past 5 years because of the pandemic and wanting more protections. So there's rising labor costs at theaters, as well as the rising cost just of materials themselves, which is affecting the choice of whether to program a Shakespeare play or a smaller show. It's interesting to count the number of one-man shows that are making the right. Eddie Izzard starred in a one-man Hamlet off Broadway. That was a huge success, right? So it's Hamlet but without the other 13, 14 actors that would be on stage with Hamlet. The more provocative point is that Shakespeare's plays, which have always been controversial, have always been at the center of culture wars. And I think Shakespeare is the most censored author in the history of authors, even if you just count the 18th and 19th centuries, right? He's always been controversial. He's always been subject to censorship or mediation. Even in his own lifetime, he probably wrote stuff that has not been handed down to us, right? Because we don't have any of Shakespeare's foul papers. We don't have any drafts in his own hand. But what's really striking is that, Shakespeare's plays are also politically kind of seen as, I don't want to say the word toxic, but controversial, going into areas that we don't necessarily want to go into or think about. These plays like Othello, these plays like Taming of the Shrew, these plays like The Merchant of Venice are, I think, daunting for a lot of Shakespeare companies to produce during an era when we are increasingly divided politically as a country. And you don't want to get the politics of Shakespeare's plays wrong. And I think that's really interesting to observe because for a long time, Shakespeare's plays were seen as being kind of untouchably canonical and worthy of producing, perhaps especially because they were controversial or going into these complicated issues.
I mean, I think it was interesting when the Julius Caesar in New York happened and it was, Trump back in the day. And what was fascinating to me is how many of the people missed the point of Julius Caesar altogether and were just responding to the death, the killing.
And yeah, the production at the Delacorte, that was in 2017. So that was the year after Trump was elected. And the choice to stage Caesar as a kind of unmistakably Trumpian figure kind of overdetermined the meaning of that play in one direction. And it was really striking that corporate sponsors pulled out of the show. There were protests at that show. There were interactions with audience members at performances of that show. There was a political response to that show that was a departure from previous productions. And I think Julius Caesar is about Brutus in many ways. I mean, you need four amazing actors to play Brutus and Caesar and Mark Antony and Cassius. But Shakespeare's also writing about people who are so sure that they're right. And this is not my observation. The brilliant actor Patrick Page, who's here at the Shakespeare Theatre, was telling me his reading of the play. So this is really his reading. But Brutus is so sure that he's virtuous and he's so sure that he's right that he's decided to kill Caesar before he has a compelling reason to do so. Caesar's crowned himself emperor, but he hasn't done anything tyrannical. The killing of Caesar is preemptive. It's a preemptive murder or assassination of Caesar. Macbeth is way more conflicted about killing Duncan than Brutus is about killing Caesar. Brutus is looking for reasons to justify the murder of Caesar. Right? And that's a story that I think resonates with what's happening right now in our country. Where everyone is so sure that they are justified and right in their criticism of the other side, that they're willing to go to extremes. John Wilkes Booth famously, when he assassinated Lincoln, shouted lines from Julius Caesar. He saw himself as a latter-day Brutus, and he had a brother whose middle name was Brutus, who was literally named after Brutus. And that's also a Washingtonian Shakespearean drama, right? That has
there you go, yeah. Bring it full circle.
So yeah, I think Shakespeare, he's not making a judgment about whether Caesar is Trump, or, I mean, obviously he doesn't know about Trump being elected 400 years later, right? But he's not interested necessarily in judging Caesar as a tyrant or Brutus as a dangerous demagogue. He's interested in examining those behaviors. And when you suspend judgments and you explore the plays, they have so many revealing things to say without leading you to. They don't tell you what to think. They just show you these things to think about. And that's
I
why the
think
play.
Patrick Page, when he was on our show, said Shakespeare asks the questions, he doesn't give you the answers.
Yes, and I think we're in a moment right now where we're really looking some for answers. We're looking to be told what to think. We're looking to be told what to do. And it's destabilizing when you encounter artworks that don't do that. But that doesn't mean that the artworks themselves are reductive in their meaning. It means we're being reductive in how we're interpreting.
You reference a long train of historical productions in which the politics of the day came to the fore. But if it were not for a design choice or design choices that drew explicit connections to polarizing topics, these plays potentially serve as safe places to discuss potentially hot button issues precisely because they offer a level of remove. One would think.
Well, I think that is the hope, obviously. The hope is that um, these plays can be places where there is an open forum for all to come and to put aside their own differences, right? And to be united in just the act of watching and experiencing something together. I think that's what's really special about the theater that arguably no other art form can rival is that unlike a movie, for cinema you can be anywhere in the country, right, and see the same movie. But for a theater, you have to actually gather in the same physical location at the same time. And unlike ballet or opera, the vessel for Shakespeare's art is language, is rhetoric, is argumentation and debate and psychology. So it immerses us in a different kind of mental process than maybe going to the opera or the ballet does, which otherwise has the same combination of physical space and time and duration. So there's something about the theater itself that is a kind of civic act, right? You are becoming for those 2 hours traffic of the stage, you are becoming a citizen in something, a member of a community. And yeah, there's a lot of anxiety that goes along with that, right? What community are you joining into? What are the values of this community? What does it mean to be gathered together to celebrate X or Y or Z? What stories matter? Who is represented on stage? How is it being represented? These things become very important decisions. And you're tacitly, I think, accepting them if you go to the theater, right? We don't have a culture in America, or maybe we used to in the 19th century, where people would stand up and throw tomatoes at actors if they didn't like what they were seeing. But we don't have that today. So I think that hopefully Shakespeare's plays can someday be a safe space. But I do think that a lot of, and I would include myself in this. I think that sometimes it feels like things are maybe too close to the bone in Shakespeare's plays.
Now, is this precisely where your role as artistic producer intersects with the business of running a large Shakespearean theater company in a major city? What is it that an artistic producer or the artistic producer does?
Well, I think I wear a number of different hats at the company. Obviously, I work with Simon on curating the offerings. And then there's also the kind of care that goes into each specific production once it's in rehearsal and once it opens, So working with the creative teams, helping directors, designers, actors to explore the various meanings of the work, I think is part of the mandate of my job. So it's a combination of what I used to do as a dramaturg, but with a larger kind of holistic curatorial perspective. But part of what I was hoping to get across with the articles, I was not pointing the finger at other Shakespeare theaters in the country and saying, you're not doing enough Shakespeare. I was also very much including us in this larger kind of pattern that seems to be affecting everyone, and trying to figure out some of the reasons why. So using my, I guess, insider's perspective of the fact that, yes, I'm aware of how many Shakespeare companies are doing Agatha Christie adaptations. I'm aware of how easy it is to do a musical, or how tempting it is to say that a musical in place of a Shakespeare, well, that's got a big cast, it's got spectacle, it's got costumes, it's got dancing, it's got songs, right? So it's providing you some of the thrills of a flashier production of Shakespeare with a title that's from the 20th century that might be more familiar, right, to younger audiences. Um, that's all kind of like the business end of the job. But then I also have the kind of artistic end of the job, which is like, well, Shakespeare's plays are really good, and some of them are better than others. But like when you see a really special production of a Shakespeare play, it involves you in a kind of level of thinking, in a kind of process of thinking that very, very few other artworks do. And I do think there's a danger of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? Of just running away from anything controversial. Whereas if you spend some time with these things that seem to be on the surface level endorsing a point of view that you don't agree with, on closer inspection, it's a lot more complicated. And that teaches us, I think, something about how to be citizens in a divided society. And it teaches us how to have empathy and tolerance for other points of view.
Just for fun, I'll throw one of your quotes back at you. And this comes from your article, Cancel Shakespeare, from August 23rd, 2023. Taken out of context, you make this bold statement: good, cancel Shakespeare. It's about time.
So that was a piece that I wrote a couple years ago when there were all these stories about high schools and public libraries that were pulling Shakespeare off the shelves. And again, it's interesting how Shakespeare finds himself at the center of these culture wars because he's writing about stuff that has not changed. He's writing about human nature, which has not changed over the last 400 years. So my perspective at the time was one of relief that, like, yes, finally Shakespeare can be cool again. He can be censored again. He can be taboo. For hundreds of years, Shakespeare was not the provenance of the conservatives. He was the provenance of the bohemians, of the artists, of the people who lived a life outside of acceptable bourgeois morality. And it seemed like the wheel was turning back in that direction. Like Gus Van Sant in the 90s made My Own Private Idaho, a movie starring Keanu Reeves and River Phoenix as gay hustlers in the Pacific Northwest. And that was a queer adaptation of Henry IV, Part One. Like where are the indie films out there that are queer adaptations of Titus Andronicus or Two Gentlemen of Verona? Like let's bring that kind of Shakespeare back. So that was kind of the spirit that I was writing that earlier piece in. It was looking at this aspect of Shakespeare and censorship from a different lens. I think that like artistic institutions can censor themselves from doing Shakespeare, right? And then Shakespeare's plays, as written, can be censored after they've been circulating or matriculating by these other institutions of education or libraries. So it's something that works in a number of different ways. And yeah, I thought it was actually a good thing that there was a conversation that was being started about whether Shakespeare was obscene or violent or bawdy or depressing, because yes, he is all of those things, but all of those things are part of the human experience and they're worth depicting in art, even if that art is maybe something that should be consumed by mature audiences. Sometimes Shakespeare is not G-rated. He's not Disney. And that's a good thing ultimately.
What could possibly be more representative of institutionalized Shakespeare than the Shakespeare Theatre Company of Washington, D.C.? It's got to be like one of the grand dames of Shakespeare in the United States. And yet, you're right, we should hail the return of the arts and humanities to bohemian weirdos.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The idea that Shakespeare is something that it's a viable career, right? That if you're an aspirational professional, and I say this as someone who has been working in theater for almost 2 decades, right? I've made my living professionally, right, from the Shakespeare and theater industry in America, and I'm super lucky and super privileged and super grateful that I've had those opportunities. But for a long time, Shakespeare was not something that was considered, theater itself was not something that was considered particularly socially reputable. And I think it's easy to think that Shakespeare has always had the status that he has now to certain pockets of the population. But that's also not true. That is largely itself a kind of historically constructed thing. Um, and in all this wrestling over what Shakespeare is, I think there's another kind of wrestling match over who does Shakespeare belong to? Does Shakespeare belong to the left or to the right? And one of the things that was not actually published in the Times piece is the story about the Folger Library in Washington, D.C., and how they received a letter in the run-up to the January 6th insurrection from anonymous people who were actually going to be participating in the storming of the Capitol. And this letter said to the Folger, essentially, don't have anything to worry about from us. We love Shakespeare. We consider Shakespeare to be sacrosanct, and we're not going to, barge into your building and harm your building, because the Folger Library is located right next to the Supreme Court, right next to the Library of Congress, and steps away from the U.S. Capitol building. So, in other words, people were willing to defecate in the halls of the Capitol, but not in the halls of Shakespeare, which I think is saying something about our times, that Shakespeare is being wrestled over. Shakespeare is being claimed, being used as a kind of political weapon, even in these culture wars. There's a lot of wrestling over what Shakespeare means, what Shakespeare represents. And I wanted to stick up for, Shakespeare representing something cool and Shakespeare representing something that was maybe worth censoring. I wanted to stand up for the Shakespeare who was the enemy of the Victorian prudes and the puritanical settlers and founders of some of the colonies in North America. And that is something that also Shakespeare represents, and that he's always represented for many years. In the decades after his death, I'm talking about the 1620s, 30s, 40s, he was more known as an author of erotic verse, right, as the author of Venus and Adonis, than he was known really for his plays. He was known as a kind of textbook for dirty sexual things. And I think that's so fascinating how Shakespeare himself is somebody who changes over time through these kind of culture wars and censorship battles.
But there's another part of the economic equation which may be important, which is the receipts, right?
Yeah, does it sell tickets? Does it move at the box office the way it used to? And I think frankly, and maybe I'm being a little bit coy or, trying to not give it away, but like, yeah, it used to be bread and butter for OSF or the Old Globe to do a season of Shakespeare, and that would subsidize the other stuff. And it's almost like now it's become the opposite, where you need to do popular shows elsewhere in the season to subsidize your Shakespeare, you know? Or you get lucky and you get a Ralph Fiennes. You find an actor who is a great actor and also a big box office draw who wants to play the role, and that does the work in selling the play for you. Because the title alone, going to the theater just to see a Shakespeare play alone is not enough. And I think that is an indictment on the lack of directorial imagination, maybe, or the fact that Shakespeare has been done maybe in unimaginative ways or kind of lazy ways, right? It's very easy to assume that the plays will work if you just put them up with competence, but I think audiences can kind of tell when it's Shakespeare by the numbers, instead of a truly inspired production that has a reason to exist. So like, yeah, I think you're right, Garrett, that it is socioeconomic on the other side, which is that the plays are not as much of a box office draw as they used to be. And there's all these reasons probably for that, that are complicated to go into. But yeah, like I think with Simon, it's like, can we figure out how to get Michael Sheen or Wendell Pierce or, whoever to be in a Shakespeare, Rupert Everett. These are the kinds of people that he's talking to. And it's like, without one of those names, and if that name is a draw, without one of those names, it's hard, and I think that's been common in London for a long time. I think in London, it's like, well, you either have to have a star director or you have to have a star name to do a Shakespeare play, to make it stand out, because there's so much Shakespeare in London, right? That if you just have if you just have a kind of stock concept and a bunch of really good actors, that's not going to differentiate you in the marketplace. So I think America's becoming a little bit more mercenary in how it produces Shakespeare, because we have to be in order to compel audiences to get off their butts and go to the theater and see a show.
Yeah. Well, there's got to be a critical mass to consideration as well. I mean, I'm always going to show up for Shakespeare because I got my mind
Totally.
blown during my formative years, right? Went to one production and just took the top of my head off. And I'm chasing the dragon ever since, right? For 30
Yeah.
years.
Yeah. Yeah, this afternoon I was listening to Patrick break down the Brutus speech and the Macbeth speech, and obviously that was still in my brain. And I'm like, this is my church. This is my happy place. This is like drinking the 100 proof whiskey. It's so special. Um, but how do you convince people that they're going to experience something like that?
But
Um,
it's got to have enough critical mass to sustain it, to sustain itself. And maybe once it drops below a critical level, there's no going back from it in terms of cultivating an audience. I don't know. It'll be
yeah,
interesting.
well, I do think it's going to swing back. I think the moment that we were in culturally where we were seeking for answers that were simplistic from art and seeking for art that ratified our viewpoint, I think there's an exhaustion with that. And also, I don't think that worked. I don't think that was popular either at the box office, you know? Um, and like OSF, you could see it, they swung super hard in the direction of ignoring aesthetics and embracing a kind of social justice mission. And they've been doing that for a long time, and it's not been working for a long time. And now the new guy, Tim, I don't know if he's been on your pod, but he's going back to the older style of doing it, of doing these big communal productions that embrace the story and embrace the language and embrace the plays. So I think, and Denzel is doing Othello on Broadway. So I think like the critical mass of big actors still wanting to do these plays and companies kind of getting tired with the circular argument about whether to do them or not and just saying, well, maybe we should just do them really fucking well. you know like maybe if we just do them really well, the proof will be in the pudding. I'm optimistic about the future in that regard, but I do think it's like it should be a constant battle, right? We should have to justify our existence. We should say what we offer is special, and you must come see what we do, right? I think that's where we want to be, right? If we're just lazy and saying, well, people are going to come because we are the Shakespeare Theater and we're producing Shakespeare, that's a kind of lazy or contemptuous attitude to have. So it's good to be reminded of the dangers of not having Shakespeare because it makes Shakespeare all that much more valuable.
What a cool place to leave our discussion today. But I would be remiss if I didn't give you the chance to touch on the upcoming Shakespeare adjacent productions that are happening at Shakespeare Theatre Company in DC.
Well, we currently have running, and thank you for asking, Garrett. It's always great to have a chance to plug the exceptional work that the company does. We're currently running an amazing play called Kunene and the King by Dr. John Connie, who is a legendary South African actor, playwright, and social justice activist. He's one of the performers in the famous South African theater season at the Royal Court Theatre in London that happened during apartheid. He was arrested after returning to South Africa and put in solitary confinement for 15 days before people like Ian McKellen and Dame Judi Dench and an international outcry of theater artists and activists called for his release. He's written this amazing play about King Lear, essentially, in modern day post apartheid South Africa and the resonances of Shakespeare in that divided society. And then at the end of the season, we're doing a world premiere adaptation of Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, told from the perspective of Elizabeth Frankenstein, the fiance of Victor, Dr. Frankenstein. So it's a play that's it's all the events from the original novel by Shelley, but you're looking at it kind of the way that Mary Shelley would have looked at it, through the eyes of this central female character, and asking the question of who's the real monster here. Is it the creature, or is it Victor, who is gaslighting and manipulating and running away to Zurich to create life instead of getting married. When you look at it through that lens, it's a very bizarre way that he behaves. He behaves in these totally inexplicable ways as people are getting murdered left and right. So it's a fascinating adaptation by Emily Burns, who is an associate director at the National Theatre in London, who worked on our production of Macbeth last year. She worked on a production of Much Ado we did a couple of years ago. She's a brilliant young director, playwright, and dramaturg who's kind of a rising star in London. So we're very much looking forward to her coming to Washington and doing Frankenstein.
Drew Lichtenberg, thank you so much for coming to speak with us today. It's been a delight.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a total pleasure.
And thank you for listening to The State of Shakespeare. Thanks for joining us for the State of Shakespeare podcast. We invite you to visit stateofshakespeare.com for more episodes, information about each of our guests, and the Shakespeare text you heard on the program, and much more. And we welcome you to join the discussion by liking us on Facebook. That's www.stateofshakespeare.com. Thanks for listening.